Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about Withnail I. This 1987 film is celebrated as a cult classic for its depiction of self-destructive young Englishmen at the end of the 1960s. We discuss how creator Bruce Robinson got it made and whether it congratulates its characters for their alcoholism or criticizes their generation and the end of that era's British culture.
You can go to patreon.com/supercontext to leave a comment with your favorite line from Withnail I, or you can write us an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. Have you seen it? Are you going to see it?
What is your blood alcohol content level?
So, Chris, I'm not a fan of Wikipedia. I have a lot of problems with the sort of echo chamber of, someone cites something from Wikipedia in an article, and then that article becomes the secondary source for Wikipedia, and then eventually people start saying, oh yeah, Alec Baldwin was in the Limp Bizkit video for Break Stuff. Okay. But...
This is your obligatory librarian.
Yes, exactly. But I was thinking about how Withnail I is a quote-unquote cult film.
Uh-huh.
And it's been a while since I really thought about cult films or a cult film that I watch or anything like that. It's just sort of Rocky Horror Picture Show is over here, settled in. And then Big Lebowski and that whole convention they do every year is over here. And okay, I don't really need to worry about cult films anymore. But then I said, okay, let me go to the internet and ask it, what is a cult film? Who has codified cult film? And I discovered in Wikipedia that no one. It's just a thing that people say, and it's taken on a lot of meanings, and people try to formalize it, and its formal definition is far too big to really have any meaning.
It's interesting because I always assumed that it was pretty easily defined since it was like a category in video stores when we were growing up. Like if you worked at a video store, you had to know which films to shelve on the cult shelf.
That's right. And I think this is where it's, if you have to ask, you'll never know.
Maybe.
I don't know. I can't describe a cult film, but I know one when I see it.
See, I just assume I could be wrong here. I've always assumed a cult film is a film that wasn't wildly successful during its theatrical release and has become more successful in its home video release than it was when it was originally brought to the public.
There are many films like that, though, that don't get cult status.
Would you call The Thing a cult film?
Well, see, now I don't know.
See, I think it's a cult film, yeah.
Yeah?
Because of that criteria.
Well, look, I know that we pay dues and we do the sacrifice every year. I always like that particular convention, but yeah, no, I don't know. A cult film, yes, it has that established, not very popular and then intensely popular.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also some people don't let just a regular movie. It has to be Buckaroo Banzai or Rocky Horror or The Thing. There's certain science fiction or extraordinary circumstances in the story of the film.
So what you're talking about, it sounds to me, is not only do they have to be successful after their original release, but they also have to have a fandom that has an identity built up around the film.
That's where it really gets into. That's where the rubber meets the road, the identity, I think.
So that, I think, is interesting in respect to Withnail I, because as we'll talk about in this episode, this film was successful when it came out.
Successful enough.
Yeah. But has a cult following now and a fandom associated with it that has created their own sets of meaning about the film.
Yeah. So you have been hearing about Withnail I for years.
Yeah. No, I first heard about it through this show. We've had many listeners tell us that we should do an episode on this. That's why we scheduled it for the last couple months that we're doing Super Context. I can't remember who it was who first recommended it, but it's come up multiple times. You've seen it. I've been looking forward to it.
And what did you think of it? This is the subjective part.
I thought it was fine. I can understand why someone would really get into it and attach meaning to it in their early 20s, especially closer to its release date. So I'm thinking of people like you who were probably in college watching this on VHS while they were drinking.
Chris, you don't have to hold back. You can say it. I saw it in the 90s.
In the 90s. But so my point is that like I watched it and I was like, yeah, this is fun. I watched it in like a unpleasant manner because it's incredibly difficult to get a hold of here in the States, especially right now during the coronavirus.
That was wild when you sent me a message saying, hey, how do I get this? It seems like it's only in one place. And I admit, I know that you can find things. I know that you're not an idiot when it comes to media. But I did have a moment of like, well, surely you can get it.
It's
Chris.
the only paid streaming service it's on is the Criterion Channel.
And if you go to get a Blu-ray or a DVD, it's kind of like, oh, these are all region 2.
Yep. Right. So for people in America, it's difficult. I should qualify. And I eventually found that somebody ripped it on Daily Motion. And so I watched the whole thing on my computer on dailymotion.com.
Wow.
Which means that there were no subtitles available and the audio was pretty poorly ripped. So,
oh, wow. So you didn't actually see this movie?
I mean, I didn't really feel like I got the full punch of the dialogue, you know?
Right.
I picked up what was going on and everything, and then doing the research, obviously, I was just making fun of you off air. People love to quote this film, and so, you know, I got some of the big quotes through the research, but in general, watching it, I was just kind of like, okay, I get it. Like, this is fun, but I didn't see it as, like, cause to be a great. Other than that, like, looking at it in retrospect, you can go, oh, wow, this is really neat how it, like, launched the careers of Richard E. Grant and Paul McGann.
Did you hear anything that you did not know originated in Withnail I? In particular, like phrases?
No.
Okay.
I mean, these are not the kind of quotes that I would be exposed to. And that leads me to my question for you. So I was watching this and I was like, oh, okay, it's this kind of film. And so I have this question for you, and it's a genuine question. I'm not trying to be snarky or mean.
I know.
Why is it that some people who drink spend so much time celebrating their drinking? Yeah. I'm not saying celebrating while they're drinking. I'm saying celebrating the fact that they drink. It's almost self-congratulatory, this like back patting of like, hey, can you believe it? We spend so much time doing this thing.
Yeah.
And, you know, and most of the audience knows, I don't drink. I haven't in, over 20 years. And so oftentimes when I go out, if I go to a bar with friends, they get a little squirrely about me sitting there and not drinking. They get self-conscious about it. And I have many friends who do what is going on in this film, who just talk about their drinking more than the drinking.
Yes. I think you should change a couple words in your question.
Okay.
Why do some people who have a death wish spend so much time thinking about it?
That's you. I did not want to be that judgmental about it because I don't think that's the case with everyone. But if the audience isn't aware, you used to be like this and you aren't anymore.
Suicidally drunk. Yes. But on top of that, I think that even without the kind of clear alcohol abuse, right, that there is a streak in all of us of sort of self-abnegation. self-negation, and that there is a way to celebrate that, or there are multiple ways to celebrate that, and one of them is substance abuse of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get, what's the line from Fear and Loathing? Once you get locked into a pretty serious drug collection, it's hard to get out of it, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think this is just one facet of the diamond of the kind of anti-life sort of drive.
It's the anti-life equation.
Whoa, I feel like I stepped into something. May I step back? May I jeter from whatever it is that I just said?
Here, I'll help.
Try again.
I'll help you. So I'm glad you brought up Fear and Loathing, because this movie gets compared to Fear and Loathing a lot. We'll talk about why. I thought it was interesting because I saw Fear and Loathing in my early 20s, and I love that movie. And I saw it. I was not a drinker when I saw it.
Yeah. Or a drug user, which, I mean, you were not a hallucinogenic user, which is probably more the key to Fear and Loathing.
And I think that Fear and Loathing works for me now on a different level than Withnail I seems to work, because, and this may just be because of Hunter S. Thompson's mission, because of how it operates as a critique of American culture and politics.
Interesting for such a not American movie.
Yeah, right? And this film didn't feel like that to me, but then reading the research, it's clear that it very much feels like that to people in the UK. That when they watch this, they see it as a condemnation of class and of the 60s and this a certain kind of mentality.
This is the moment where the water broke, where the high tide hit and washed back, same as Thompson said about Fear and Loathing. And if I confused anyone, including myself, I should say, Fear and Loathing is a very American movie. I was just surprised that a very not American movie like Withnail I could then feel like Fear and Loathing to you.
Well, I mean, not only is it like a buddy comedy about two people on a journey who are just like self-destructing, but production-wise, like Terry Gilliam was involved in the production company that made Withnail I, and it was clearly aware of it and was probably referencing it down the road when he made Fear and Loathing. And we'll see later on in the notes, Johnny Depp is a huge fan of this film as well, and I think he brought that as well to Fear and Loathing.
Yeah. And so the last thing I want to say about the larger question, why do people who drink spend time celebrating it? I think it's very hard to declare in the middle of destroying yourself. I recognize I'm destroying myself and it's terrible. It's much easier to say, this action which sets me apart, or this action which gives some kind of transcendent structure to my life, right, is something above and beyond regular experience.
Yeah, so that's something interesting to me, that the act of self-destruction becomes a part of your identity, and then something like this comes along, and regardless of whether it was the intention of the creator, which it does not seem it was, we'll hear a lot from him shortly, this becomes almost a totem for people whose identity is about self-destruction.
And my last thing to say about this, I recently rewatched Groundhog Day.
Okay.
And I had such a self-realization at how little I liked Phil before he became, locked in the loop and started to become a better person. Whereas when I first saw Groundhog Day, I thought, Bill Murray's so cool. Listen to how sharp he is. Listen to how,
oh, wow,
direct
really?
And cool and standoffish. I just thought he was cool.
Yeah.
And Phil is a self-hating asshole.
No, he's a horrible person. Yeah, that's the theme of the movie, is that he has to become a better person.
And so there's a moment when whatever I was doing that made me feel like Phil was a hero of one kind and became a hero of another, I changed and I lost that ability to see a hero in that. And I think that for a lot of folks, Withnail is a hero of some kind.
Oh, for sure. And we'll get into that.
But they can potentially stop thinking that if their own conditions change.
Yeah, and I think that seems to be the case as well. There's some real interesting cultural identity stuff to unpack with this film. I think, too, you are inadvertently bringing up something that is also going to be part of the conversation, which is this is clearly a film that could only be made by straight white men and about straight white men.
Right. Okay, good. Let's put that up there on the shelf.
Yeah.
And let's get into it.
So Withnail I is a 1987 film that was written and directed by Bruce Robinson, and it stars Richard E. Grant and Paul McGann. I assume this movie came out in the 90s, but it turns out it's late 80s. I guess maybe it was the 90s when the ball got rolling, really, with it.
Well, I think that it influenced filmmakers who made their movies in the 90s. That's the deal. You know, like in 1987 it happened, and then everyone who was in high school thought, oh, I want to fucking make this movie when I get out.
Maybe, yeah. So Bruce Robinson, not somebody I'm super familiar with. He's an English director, a screenwriter, a novelist, and an actor. He also directed The Rum Diary, which is essentially like a prequel sequel to Fear and Loathing. So that's another connection with that. And he wrote the screenplay for The Killing Fields. That blew me away.
Yeah.
And he did acting, and he starred in a apparently well-received 1968 version of Romeo and Juliet.
So I would say that he is not as famous or as good at all of those things: director, screenwriter, novelist, and actor. Mm-hmm. Right? I think
he's a killer writer.
Yeah, he's pretty much known for being able to pull Withnail I off, and then has been kind of, I wouldn't say milking it, but that was the launch of his career.
He'll give us the trajectory, and it's interesting because I think in a lot of ways he resents this film now.
Yeah, because it's doing something very different than he set out to do.
Yeah. So he went on after Withnail I to make movies like How to Get Ahead in Advertising, Jennifer 8, In Dreams, and Return to Paradise. I have seen none of those.
Oh.
I'm only aware of maybe one of them before today.
Yeah, I didn't realize that Jennifer 8 was his. And Jennifer 8 was almost a great movie.
Okay.
And In Dreams, I know I saw that, but I don't remember it at all.
Yeah, all of this stuff skipped me by. But this film, Withnail I, is the one that just everybody attaches to him, even though he's done all this work since then. It's based on his own experience of living as an out-of-work actor in Camden Town during the end of the 60s. It is a black comedy. It's bleak. It's funny. It's about... the plot is relatively simple. Two roommates who are out-of-work actors decide to go on a vacation to the countryside, and everything goes wrong because one of them is like a just self-destructive alcoholic in the worst way.
Yeah.
And it's funny.
It wasn't to you. Was it funny to you?
Yeah.
Or was it?
No, there's some good bits in there. Yeah, I thought there was some... the dialogue is very well written. It's clever.
It's full of wit and sharpness and surprise in sort of a psychological way. Like the way that people respond to things is not pat.
Right.
It doesn't... You're not expecting this to happen and then it happens. There's a lot of... and there's also a lot of like detail of each beat in the story. Mm-hmm. Like it's not real time in any way, but it's very careful with each of the things you get to see. There's enough trivia for every scene to fill a whole director's commentary, for a regular movie. Yeah.
This is a quote from the research. The whole thing's become enshrined in cinema folklore. And we'll get into some of this stuff. Some of it's relevant. Some of it I skipped over. Like Richard E. Grant, for instance, can't drink alcohol without getting violently ill.
Yeah, he's missing an enzyme of some kind.
Mm-hmm. And then there's this rumor that Bruce Robinson wouldn't do any take that made the crew laugh. So like they purposely were trying to be as deadpan as possible on set, apparently. So, okay. Again, like, I think the trivia legend stuff around it isn't as much about the film as it is about the people watching it, but we'll get further into that.
Yeah, and we should just state right at the outset, this is not going to be a detailed description of all of the weird little ins and outs of the filming. That's out there. There are books written about how Withnail I was made. We want to talk about this from a bit of a distance and try and find the super context stuff in Withnail I.
So Robinson talks about, he's looking back on the time that he was writing about, and he points out that, Camden at that time was totally different than it is now. And he says, quote, there was an entirely different species of resident there. He wrote this in 1969, 1970. So it didn't come out for almost 20 years after he wrote it.
He wrote it contemporaneous with his experience of that time.
Yeah. He says this: it was a particularly vicious winter. I had no heat. All I had was an Oxfam overcoat and a light bulb. I used to swipe abandoned vegetables off Camden Market. There were always apples and turnips that were just hanging about when they would close on Saturday. It was awful. I was left with no money, no food, a gas oven, one light bulb, and a mattress on the floor. I was an actor, and I couldn't get a job. So one day I came to the flat, and it was snowing, and I started weeping and screaming at the floorboards. I was begging the god of equity, or any fucking god, to help me. And then it really made me laugh, the predicament that I was in. I laughed hysterically over it. And I had this typewriter that I used to try and write poetry on. I sat down, and I started writing this story about my predicament, involving me and my friend, who had now gone.
I mean, that sounds like a universal artist story.
Yeah, and I think that's another reason why Withnail I resonates with so many people. And he'll talk about this later on, and so does Richard E. Grant. Most people have a moment in their lives that they can relate to Withnail I and Robinson's moment here, because they have been poor and had to pull themselves up from it, right? I was thinking about this while I was watching this movie, and I've mentioned it several times on the show. I've talked to you about it off air. I lived in utter fucking squalor throughout my early 20s. I lived in conditions that just were appalling in retrospect. I remember one place I lived in, which I believe there were 9 people sharing one half of a house. I lived in the attic, and I slept on a mattress on the floor. And I remember coming down one day to go to work, and I walked through the dining room, and there was a rat crawling around on one of the cupboards. And I just looked at it and was like, yeah, that makes sense, and went to work.
And the rat didn't scamper? He looked at you and he was like...
he didn't even...
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. This was the place I've talked about before where, like, at night when I would go to the bathroom, I would have to clap my hands together before I turned on the lights to make the silverfish scatter.
Yeah. So I think about this all the time, and I imagine that I said this the last time you told me, these details of the house. There was a time in the 60s when you could live much cheaper than you can now.
Mm-hmm.
And I have read many residents of the 60s talk about the moment that the oil crash came in the early 70s and changed what it was like to live a artist or edgy or countercultural life.
Yeah,
like it went from you being able to pay your rent and buy your food on tips from wherever you were working into something completely different. And so people attempting to live like their heroes 20 years later discovered that they could not manage it. Mm-hmm. You had to get 9 people in that half a house instead of the 2 people it would have been in the 60s. Or the 4 sculptors taking over an entire floor of a factory in New York in the late 60s working on their stuff, who could afford it because the economy hadn't yet contracted.
Yeah. He goes on to say this actually was written originally as a novel, not as a screenplay. A friend of his gave the novel to a producer, I guess, who wanted Robinson to make it into a comedy television show. And then another guy came along and said, actually, this would make a great movie. In 1980, so 7 years before the film came out, that person gave Robinson money to adapt the script. But then the whole project was in limbo for 6 years.
Now, we should point out, those couple sentences, that's 10 years. If he wrote it in 1970,
yep,
then, someone wanted him to adapt it into a TV series, someone wanted him to do a movie. That's 10 years to 1980. And then Robinson gets some money to make a script out of it. Mm-hmm. And then it goes into limbo. And eventually, and here's the sort of the wild what turn, mm-hmm. The Beatle, George Harrison, got a hold of the script and funded the movie.
Yeah. George Harrison's production company is why this was made. So it is an odd little film. And it's one of those, you talk about the economy changing how art is produced. I think a film like this would be a lot harder to make nowadays.
For sure.
I think you could only make something like this maybe through like Kickstarter or something like that. There's no way, again, because of the economies of scale that we've talked about on the show, most films are either under $1 million or over, $20 million? The middle range there, most producers don't want to fuck around with because there's a lot more risk of getting their return back.
Yeah, and the audiences aren't built in. The art house audience isn't built in anymore to these movies. But then there's also just the fact that money is different than it used to be. Like Robinson talks about this when he says they went back to the place, to film this. He said, if you wanted to live in a house, if you wanted to buy a house on the street I used to live on, it would cost $1 million. And, or £1 million, excuse me. And when I lived there, the building I lived in cost about £8,000.
Yeah. Yeah. We just experienced this the other day. We were, our next door neighbors moved out of their house. And we were kind of curious, like, are they selling it? What's that house worth? And my wife looked it up. The last time that house was on the market, it sold for $16,000.
Holy shit!
In the early 90s. Yeah. And I would guess, because there was no guesstimate for what it's worth now, but I would guess it's easily worth $500,000 now.
I have to withdraw from this conversation to be able to continue the recording. Okay, so here's the big thing about Withnail I in terms of Bruce Robinson's life. He had a person that he was able to build Withnail out of. Mm-hmm. Vivian McCarroll? Is that how you'd say it?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I'm not quite sure, but that's as close as I think we're going to get. He was apparently an actor that was the roommate that Withnail was based on.
Yeah, and so the I is sort of the place that Bruce Robinson was in. Robinson said, I didn't sit there with a tape recorder and a notepad writing down what Viv said. I just took his acidity, his pompous cowardice, that right there, pompous cowardice. That's, I think, what was it? Eddie Izzard, or Izzard, he talked about how Scooby-Doo and Shaggy are extraordinary characters in literature because they are cowards, mm-hmm. and there is nothing that cuts that cowardice. They are simply these universal, excitable cowards. And the only character that he connects that to is like Falstaff was a coward, mm-hmm. and yet had a melancholy instead of just this kind of extraordinary full energy cowardice. And when I first heard that, I thought, whatever, man, you're just being a lunatic. But now I realize that there is, now at this point in my life, the embodiment of something that we have, in a kind of unfettered way, can be very validating or empowering.
Yeah, and that seems to be what the case is with this character, more so than the I character. I think Withnail is what most people relate to, which is ironic because I think the Paul McGann character is supposed to be the point of identification.
Right. Okay, now I bombed out of that quote, so let me go back. Robinson says, I took Vivian McCarroll's acidity, pompous cowardice, and his very pungent sense of humor, and I wrote the character Withnail. The I character is someone who's always constantly saving the day, which I did a lot with Vivian.
So there's a little bit more about the genesis of the Withnail character. These things are about the actor McCarroll that he was based on, and a friend of both of them says this. He says, well, Vivian definitely had his opinions. I never witnessed him being as nasty as Richard E. Grant is as the character, but Withnail and I had loads of Vivian in it, but they were an extreme version of him. He wasn't a character. There's artistic license in the film. One thing that Bruce warned me about was that I couldn't claim that anything said in the film was ever uttered by Vivian, or else he'd issue a writ. He's adamant that Viv didn't actually say these things, although he stated in a revised screenplay of the film that although there isn't a line of Viv's in Withnail, his horrible, quote, wine-stained tongue may as well have spoken every word.
So Robinson actually had a moment where he had to tell his friends, don't in any way suggest that you see Vivian and remember him saying shit like that, or we'll all be in trouble.
Yeah. And so the name Withnail seems odd, right? And I had no idea what this movie was about when all of you were recommending it to me. So I was just like, wow, that's a really curious name for a film. I wonder what that's about. I don't want to look it up. I want to go in cold to just get it. Apparently, it's because he spelled the guy's name wrong. So he wanted him to be based on somebody whose name was Withnail, his last name, and he spelled it with an I, with nail, and then just kept it.
And here's a bit about Jonathan Withnail. That's why he's part of this. Robinson says, he backed his Aston Martin into a police car, and he was like the coolest guy I'd ever met in my life, so consequently the name stayed in my head. So Vivian McCarroll is the crazed, alcoholic, horribly charismatic roommate.
Mm-hmm.
And Jonathan Withnail is the coolest guy Robinson ever met in his life. And he's kind of putting these characters, like these literal characters, into this person.
Yeah, and he says this about the Withnail guy as well. He was an upper-class ne'er-do-well. He was a total alcoholic. He tells the story again about the Aston Martin. And his reaction at that age was like, wow, this guy's extraordinary. You know, it's kind of the same way that you were about Bill Murray. Like, oh, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, despite the fact that Robinson can look back and say, the relationship between the characters Withnail and I is permeated with decay. You know, one character has hope, I, but the other bastard has no hope. There's none. There's nowhere to go. He hasn't got anyone to play off. He's going to spend his life drinking himself to death, which is exactly what Vivian did.
Yeah.
The man who is the sort of core of Withnail, the character, died in 1990 from throat cancer because he was, I guess, an alcoholic who damaged basically all the tissues, by drinking and then vomiting. They'd sewn up his throat. He couldn't swallow. He had this some kind of colostomy style pipe in him. He would drink by pouring liquor directly into his body using the medical devices that were meant to, save him. Mm-hmm. The guy was from what Robinson says, this guy was a horribly tragic person.
Yeah. Exactly. I think Robinson's point is that this person isn't supposed to be admired, especially when the way the movie ends. He's not to be admired.
Except, And I'm not saying, oh no, he is supposed to be admired. I'm just saying, except when you put an actor like Richard E. Grant, who we now know is intensely charismatic and like very funny and smart, and give him well-written, rehearsable versions of this person, you get more of a... God, I think someone compares him to Loki somewhere in the notes.
Ironically, I think Richard E. Grant is going to be in the Loki TV show. I saw that in his new credits. So yes.
Okay, but like a trickster god or a supernatural entity that is meant to scatter life so that you then somehow become a different person. Like Withnail is Vivian McCarroll in some way. Ennobled, because of the performance.
So getting back to the production, so Dennis O'Brien was George Harrison's, I guess, co-business partner in this production company, and as I mentioned, they'd worked on films with the Monty Python crew, and when this film was being shot, he almost shut the entire operation down because he was under the impression from working with Monty Python that all comedy had to be brightly lit. And this film was not.
I think that's less of a literal thing and more of a sort of like comedy should be brightly lit both on the set and in the story.
And so there's just like a lot of quotes here from people working on the film about their interactions with this producer. For instance... there's a conversation with the actor who played Uncle Monty, who I only know from the Harry Potter movies, so it was extremely odd seeing him in this role here.
To me, it was the opposite. Like, not just because of Withnail I, but because Richard Griffith is amazing, and I've seen him in so many movies. When he ended up in Harry Potter, I had a moment of, really?
Yeah.
Is that what's happening now?
Well, it's sort of the same thing with the, I can't remember her name either, the actress who plays his wife in Harry Potter, who is on Killing Eve now. And there's this like weird cognitive dissonance where you're like, wow, that's amazing.
The sort of MI6 leader, Fiona Shaw.
Yeah, Fiona Shaw. That's her name.
Okay.
Yeah. She was also on a season of Candle Cove that I watched recently.
So Griffith said that this producer suggested that it should be like, and I don't know who this person is, Kenneth Williams, but the description is arms flailing, that it should be a slapsticky, fat cartoon character.
They wanted him to be a homosexual caricature.
Yeah. Uncle Monty in the story is a closeted gay uncle of Withnail. And
is he closeted?
Well, covert, I guess.
Okay.
I don't think you could be nearly as openly gay in the late 60s as you can now.
Yeah, especially if you're like an aristocrat. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's basically a fuck pad that he loans to the guys.
Cottage, yeah.
Yeah. But Robinson said the producers, thought an effeminate homosexual was amusing, and I didn't. So there was a walk around this hillside, and I said to them, I'll get on the bus now and go home. I really do know what this film is, and it will be funny. Either I'll walk off now, or you're going to have to trust me and shut up. So this was some kind of, like, bravado, right? That he was going to, I don't think, had he made anything before this?
I think he had been an actor before this.
An actor,
and
but
he had won an award for writing The Killing Fields. He hadn't directed, I don't believe.
Got it. So he is basically telling the folks who found the script amusing, I'm not going to do this the way you found it funny in your head. We're going to do it in a very different way. The actor who plays Paul McGann, said, we thought we were being hysterical. When we rehearsed it, it was going great. And then suddenly someone tells us we're about as funny as an orphanage on fire.
Yeah, Richard E. Grant was apparently really nervous about this. He thought the film was going to get shut down. This was the first movie he'd ever made, and he had told everybody, oh, I'm in this movie. And then he's like, no, it's never going to happen.
Right. So we should take from this sort of summation of, even though the script got the production company to fund it,
yeah,
they didn't recognize the way that Robinson wanted to make it funny.
Well, let's remember, it got George Harrison to fund it. The guy who was causing all the problems was George Harrison's business partner.
Sure.
So it's possible that George Harrison was just like, make this movie, and his business partner was like, I don't know. I'm going to oversee everything.
Well, let me condense that then a little bit. Robinson didn't have a shorthand to explain to them, it's going to be funny this way.
Yeah.
They were trying to tell him, make it like other things that are funny. And he's saying, no, I want to do it the way I want to do it. Trust me, it'll be funny. He didn't have anything to sort of back him up. He couldn't rely on this movie or this movie. This is how it'll be funny.
Yeah. So then we get to the point where Robinson starts talking about it in retrospect, and that it's become kind of an albatross for him. He says this: I have great affection for this film, but it's a sea anchor to me, in a sense, that it was all anyone ever wanted to talk to me about. It's 14 fucking years ago. It's longer than that now, since this interview is from then. And he says, it's like the only thing that I ever wrote. He says, every day he gets accosted by cranks in long leather coats, quoting chunks of his own dialogue back at him.
I'm sure it's not every day. It probably just feels that way.
He says, what's weird is they kind of discover it 10 years on. So all the Withnails now are all like 18 to 25 years old. Again, this was earlier. He says, these people come up to me and they say, yeah, we like to have curry and watch Withnail I at university. And I think about how that happens, and I think, oh, yeah, my fan base, they're all 18 or 19-year-old boys.
Withnail I is not a movie that was of its moment and retains its joy for people as they grow older. It retains its joy for a particular age.
Yeah, and I think that's why I had somewhat of a lukewarm reaction to it, right? Here I am at 42 watching it for the first time. It is a good movie. It's well made and it's interesting, but it didn't, like, really get its daggers in me the way it probably would have if I was younger.
Yeah. And Robinson even suggests that his career didn't really go the way he wanted it to. He says after he made Withnail, for 5 minutes, the sun shone out of his ass and everything went downhill. His Hollywood experiences, he says, which were great. I don't knock them, but Hollywood.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to be said about those movies we listed earlier. You said like one of them was almost a great movie. I think it was because he was really struggling with the system.
Yeah. At the core of sort of Robinson's artistic intentions versus what can sell, he wrote the novel and killed Withnail at the end. Mm-hmm. Withnail commits suicide in a very sort of elaborate way, drinks a bottle of wine through the barrel of a gun and then shoots himself in the head.
Maybe that's how the film should have ended, because if it had ended that way, I think it would have been a lot more obvious to people that he wasn't supposed to be a sympathetic character.
I don't know. Would it have done the work, though? I mean, I think it would have just disappeared if it had ended like that. It's like
Maybe.
A character at the end of a long-running television show dying, and then no one wants to go back and start the show again.
Mm-hmm. But he says this, when the character is left alone at the end of the film, he's alone. He knows he's fucked. That's quite a turn, and that's the way it was with Vivian. He was a complete, total fucking disaster in the life that he had.
Yeah, we worked hard on the ending, he says. Him and Richard E. Grant created this this scene of a Hamlet monologue delivered to wolves at the zoo.
Yeah.
Which is, full of meaning, very actorly.
So speaking,
can we take a moment to talk about this Fatty Grant thing?
Well, it's in the notes. Yeah, let's talk about it.
So Bruce Robinson, and the reason I'm noticing it now is that the rest of that quote, we worked hard on the ending, the build up to when Fatty Grant pulled off, did he not? That's Shakespeare at the end. It still blows me away. He just had the right rage. Bruce Robinson says that Richard E. Grant was too fat for the role, and he told him, lose the weight and you can do it.
Uh-huh.
He says, no one believes me, but I have the pictures. Grant was fat. I went looking for pictures of Richard E. Grant in his career previous to this movie, and I found a promo photo from a television show or a television movie he had done the year before.
Okay.
And unless Richard E. Grant had like a sudden ballooning, Bruce Robinson is pulling a very complicated, long-running inside joke for himself.
Oh, I think it's a total prank. Yeah, it's a gag. That's why he keeps referencing it. Yeah.
And so the reason I bring it up is to say Robinson has this streak of just for me bullshit. Like, he will not let go of the idea of saying Richard E. Grant was fat, but he lost the weight for Withnail.
Yeah.
Which he did fucking not.
Well, maybe he lost some weight. He's certainly skinny.
Oh, I'm sure he thinned out, but he wasn't fat before.
No. So that brings us to talking about Richard E. Grant. He is a Swazi English actor. He's been in everything. This guy is like in the dictionary next to character actor. It's his face.
Hey man, don't back away from Hudson Hawk.
No, I'm going to list these. These are the ones that he's mainly known for. Hudson Hawk.
I love it.
Bram Stoker's Dracula, Spice World, which was the first thing I thought of when I was watching this. Gosford Park, Logan. I forgot he's the bad guy in Logan. And he's most recently, he was in The Rise of Skywalker. He's one of the Imperial bad guys in that, which is perfect.
Spoiler alert, dude.
Oh, sorry. I know you're in a rush to watch it.
I adore Richard E. Grant.
Yeah, he's great.
He is amazing in everything he does. He is one of those people that if he just pops into a movie, you're like, oh, well, this will be cool for 5 minutes, no matter what.
Yeah. Little bit of nerd trivia I'm going to throw out here. I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking this. Charlie, you're totally unaware of this. Both Richard E. Grant and Paul McGann have ties to the Doctor Who franchise. Paul McGann was one of the Doctors.
I knew about McGann, yeah.
And Richard E. Grant, in the last couple of years, he played like a big villain on Doctor Who.
Oh, well, shit. Sounds like I'm going to watch some Doctor Who.
I don't know if you'll be able to hold up with it, but okay.
At least one episode. At least the first episode with Richard E. Grant I'll have to watch.
He's only in one episode.
Here's how good Richard E. Grant is. When he was a young, struggling actor, he was the second choice to Daniel Day-Lewis, Bill Nighy, and Kenneth Branagh for Robinson's Withnail.
Yeah, so Robinson gives these reasons why he didn't hire all those folks. He says Daniel Day-Lewis didn't turn it down as much as that time passed and then he wasn't available. Bill Nighy was very good in the auditions, but he was drinking. And he said, I thought one drunk on the set was going to be enough. I guess
Robinson is the drunk that he's referring to.
He means himself. Kenneth Branagh was an excellent actor, and he could have played Withnail, but he would have been, quote, a podgy Withnail. And there's more on that here. He says, I offered Paul's part, the I part, to Kenneth Branagh, and he turned me down. He wanted to play Withnail. I didn't want him to do that. I didn't think he had enough nobility. He's a marvelous actor, but there's something about him that is the antithesis of Byron-esque. He looks like a partially cooked donut. Richard looks like a Byron, you know.
Oh, come on. Richard looks like a fucking Byron, you know. That's what he said.
Yeah, and then in retrospect, Grant says, thank goodness, thank God, Daniel Day-Lewis turned down the role. That's all I can say. When I worked with him on the film Age of Innocence, I prostrated myself in his Winnebago, and I said, oh, Daniel, I owe you everything that's happened to me, and it's true.
Okay, so Bruce Robinson says, he swears that he was never fat, but I've got the pictures. When Richard E. Grant came along, I said, half of you has got to go. He lost all this weight, and he's never put it on again. Richard's a vicious old tart, and he obviously had the wherewithal to play Withnail. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done it like he did.
So there's been interviews with...
I call bullshit on Robinson all the way.
Here's what I think it is. I think Richard E. Grant was a normal-sized man, and Withnail was supposed to be emaciated. And so the joke has become Fatty Grant because he wasn't emaciated.
Because you were a regular person, and then you had to, like, oh God, he looks so unhealthy. He looks like a knife, right?
Yeah.
That's been used to cut something terrible.
So Grant's been interviewed many times over the years about this. Like Robinson, it's all a lot of people talk to him about, which is interesting. I would have thought it was Spice World, but, you know, everybody to each their own. Who's
your favorite Spice Girl?
Oh, Scary.
Thank you. You may now continue.
He says, who's yours?
I guess it's Ginger.
Yeah, Ginger's cool. I almost went with Ginger, but Scary's just crazy enough that I like her.
No, I'm
More.
totally. There's no wrong answer.
So Grant says, look, I knew it bone deep when I read the script that this was going to be a role for the ages. It made me laugh out loud. It was brilliantly written. The stage directions were hilarious. I'd been unemployed for 9 months, so that was the best preparation I could have had for playing an embittered, unemployed actor.
Grant says, I've spent my life playing alcoholics because my Withnail performance was so convincing.
Yeah.
And he's not a drinker because he can't. He physically can't handle it. When he drank for the rehearsals for Withnail or some kind of like, hey, let's do some research, some actorly research for what it's like, if you're really, really fucking drunk. He says it took him an entire night to get down a bottle of champagne. The director asked me to, but I paid the price. I was very, very ill. I'd have a drink and be violently sick, but I kept forcing it down, so by the next morning I was drunk, and then I passed out. I woke up 24 hours later. That's actually probably what Withnail's actual life would be like.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so it's a great irony, and I think people have a lot of fun with that. There's a lot of trivia about like what he was or was not drinking in various scenes in the film where he's pounding wine. Grant also mentions that it gets brought up with fans all the time. He says, people will not let me forget about it. When I work in the States or I'm going through an airport, or I've been in godforsaken places where I wouldn't have expected anybody to have ever even found this movie, there's always one person who has that look in their eye and will come over and say they know about the movie as though they're the only person on the planet that knew about it.
Now that is, I feel, the cult movie thing that we should be really thinking about.
Yeah, it's the attachment, the identity attachment thing. The like, this is my movie.
As though they're the only person on the planet that knew about it. That feels really good to me as the way that
the
a cult
definition of a cult
thinks
film.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting though, like Google cult film right now and all the stuff that comes up are like what I would think of as major mainstream movies.
Yeah, and this is where then you get into sort of the topics.
Mm-hmm.
A cult film becomes something that's about what shouldn't be mainstream but is mainstream. Anyway, I don't think that there's a good... If anyone knows, any listener knows the book or the article that really lays it out, that we should use as our go-to for what a cult film is, I'd love to hear about it. supercontextpodcast@gmail.com or patreon.com/supercontext.
Let's do a quick aside. If you just Google cult classics on these are the results that come up.
Okay, I'm strapped in.
The Room, Rocky Horror Picture Show, Repo the Genetic Opera, Donnie Darko, Repo Man, Blade Runner?
Yeah, see, this is where it goes completely off the rails when you get to stuff like that.
The Big Lebowski, Harold and Maude, Birdemic, Pink Flamingos, Fight Club. That's, again, I think Fight Club's a huge mainstream movie.
It's not a huge mainstream movie, but yes.
Hedwig and the Angry Inch, Buckaroo Banzai, Withnail I, Reefer Madness, Napoleon Dynamite. Again, I don't think that makes sense. Evil Dead, Eraserhead, The Warriors, Office Space, Pulp Fiction, This Is Spinal Tap, The Princess Bride. I'm going to stop here.
Yeah,
Plan
please.
9 from Outer Space.
See, there's not a thread that can connect all of those. That's like a cluster of kinds of cult films, mixed in with each other. Let us move on.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll have an answer at the end. Maybe not.
So Paul McGann, it's the 8th Doctor. That's what you know him from, right?
Is he 89?
What does that mean?
In Alien 3?
Yeah.
Or is he? Yeah.
Yeah. We'll talk about that. Alien 3 was meant to be an homage to this film.
Speaking of David Fincher.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love him in Alien 3.
He's great in Alien 3. He's okay as Doctor Who. He's only... I know you don't really give a shit about this. He was only in one TV movie, and it was kind of ludicrous. and then he came back retroactively and like did stuff. He was on Luther. Did you ever watch Luther?
You know that, right?
What's that?
I love you. You know that.
You do. How much do you love Doctor Who, though?
I love you.
Did you get around to watching Luther?
Yeah, I didn't like it.
He's on it. He's pretty good in that.
I like Idris Elba. Luther.
Yeah.
The very first episode of Luther starts with like a lot of screaming and running and all that, and
it's great.
It's like, I'm not down for this right now, and I haven't been.
You
back.
prefer your crime dramas to be quiet and slow walks.
It has to start with a guy with a gun to his own head. That's how I need my crime to start. Okay.
He was apparently also known for something called the Monocled Mutineer. I've never heard of that.
I don't think you can say that someone's known for something that you don't know what it is. You know, I feel like that's kind of not all right.
So here's how the story goes about him and Withnail I. Paul McGann was hired for the film and then fired twice. First, he wouldn't lose his Scouse accent. Robinson kept saying to him, "You've got to dump the accent, Paul. You're meant to be a lower middle class boy who's gone to drama school, and you cannot speak like that." And so I got rid of him, and then I reinstated him because he promised me he'd get rid of the accent, which he did. You can see here, Robinson had very particular ideas about how these characters should be portrayed.
It makes me think of Almost Famous. If you've ever read Cameron Crowe's discussion of Almost Famous, there's things that were exactly what happened to him in his life that he fictionalized, but all of the details had to be the same. And so he would make people do takes over and over again to get it just like he remembered, or he would say, this is exactly the place it has to happen, or exactly the way. And it made a few people crazy on set.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Was experiencing the same. Yeah, Robinson was experiencing the same thing. It's got to be this way. Although I think probably the class of each of these characters was more important than just like the tone of someone's voice or the hat they were wearing.
Oh, I think that makes sense. The class thing is important to the voice and theme of this, which is, a critique of British society.
I want to read something that McGann talks about, which I never thought about. It never connected with me, but reading it, it's like, oh yeah, everything he just said is true. So this is from an article. The movie takes place in 1969. The low budget quality leads viewers to think it was filmed at the same time because the film quality is degraded enough.
Kind of looks like it was in the 60s, yeah.
Paul McGann says, it comes from the mid 1980s, but it sticks out like a Smith's record. The provenance is from a different era. None of the production values, none of the iconography, none of the style remotely has it down as an 80s picture. I've had people say to me, geez, I thought it was from the 60s. I don't know how old they think I am.
Right. Yeah. He would be significantly older if he had shot that movie in the late 60s.
Well, maybe they just think he looks really good. Or maybe he looks so shitty that he's exactly what they would expect someone to look like.
Real quick before we move on from the actors, we've mentioned Richard Griffiths. He plays Uncle Monty, but I really think the all-star player in this film is Ralph Brown, who plays Danny, the drug dealer.
Presuming Ed.
He's quite good. And another nerdy bit of trivia is apparently Wayne's World 2 of all movies is another homage to Withnail I, and he is supposed to be playing a version of Danny in nice. Wayne's World 2.
Isn't Presuming Ed also in Alien 3?
He is. That's part of the homage.
Part of the,
Let's just skip ahead to the Alien 3 thing since we've mentioned it twice now.
Sorry, it's just stuck in my head. And McGann is an actor who I know, but I never recognize him.
Oh, really? Yeah. I think just maybe because of Doctor Who, I'm always like, oh, it's the Eighth Doctor.
Right.
In 1992, when David Fincher was making Alien 3, he wanted to do an unofficial reunion of the film. And so McGann and Brown are both in Alien 3. If you remember, that film is set on a prison planet. They are prisoners. Richard E. Grant turned down the role. He was supposed to play the Charles Dance character on Alien 3, which would have been interesting because that means Richard E. Grant would have had a sex scene with Sigourney Weaver.
Why is that interesting?
I just can't imagine that.
Yeah. And Charles Dance
is
amazing.
That's anytime his name is said, you have to say it as if it's David Bowie's Let's Dance.
Well, that's going to happen from now on for sure.
He is a national treasure, Charles Dance.
Yeah, but the wrong nation. Okay, let's talk about George Harrison.
Okay.
He's a fucking Beatle.
Uh-huh.
What else can we say?
I mean, he's a big deal. Here's the thing that I was unaware of, though. Apparently, the Beatles have strict regulations about what films their music shows up in, and the only reason this film was able to have a Beatles song on the soundtrack was because Harrison was one of the producers.
Yeah. So Handmade Films is the production company. It's British, or was. Did it? I think it's disappeared by now, hasn't it?
Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff here. It's actually owned by somebody else now.
Yeah.
So, it started off as this production company. They made this, and they made Terry Gilliam movies. They made Monty Python's Life of Brian and Time Bandits.
Chris, you're confusing your Terrys. Life of Brian was Terry Jones. Time Bandits was Terry Gilliam.
Okay.
And you know what's funny? I just did a quick Life of Brian Google search. It's playing nearby at 7 p.m. tonight.
How is that even possible with the coronavirus going on?
Well,
right now?
I don't know that anybody will be in the theater, but it is scheduled to play. But the point is, Life of Brian is on some, theater's marquee right now.
I have to admit to something that is going to upset you.
I'm totally fine with whatever you say about Monty Python.
I'm not a huge Monty Python fan. I like it kind of okay, but it just never got me at the right moment. I like Terry Gilliam's work after Monty Python a lot more.
Yeah. The thing about Life of Brian that we should talk about in terms of Withnail I, the constant quoting, the sort of quotable
fucking yes
dialogue, right?
Uh-huh.
And I cannot even remotely disparage anyone who does this because I did it for 20 years. But quoting movies is what some of us use as a personality for a little while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's something that if you ask my wife, she knows it as a bee in my bonnet. I get really annoyed when people just quote things at me. Specifically The Simpsons. I fucking hate it when somebody's just like, hey, remember that time on The Simpsons when they said such and such?
But you understand the drive because what did he say to you? Go on, bear, get.
Yeah.
And a couple other things. You know that
those are things that actually happened in my life, though.
Totally. But seeing a movie also happened in these people's lives.
Yeah.
The idea of sort of replaying a moment or sort of adding a past memory to a current moment is a powerful thing. It's just really
I get it.
And irritating when it's always movie quotes from stuff that maybe people just don't like.
Well, I don't think it has to do necessarily with whether I like it or not. I think for me, I get frustrated when people aren't able to talk openly and honestly about who they are, and they use the quotes instead of, actual direct language to talk about what they believe in or who they are or what they enjoy.
Well, I mean, that's just like your opinion, man.
Okay. So back to George Harrison's company. This, unfortunately, those films, they sound like they were big successes because they're cult films now, but they were apparently box office bombs. So by the late 80s, they had a ton of debt, and it was blamed on O'Brien. This guy, Dennis O'Brien, does not come off well in the research. Nobody seems to like him. So the company ceased operations in 1991. It was sold to Paragon Entertainment, and then George Harrison sued O'Brien for $25 million. And he said fraud and negligence. Yeah. Because he thought that comedies should be well lit. $25 million. Harrison got $11.6 million in a judgment. This company is now owned by Paragon. Paragon went on to make films under this company's title, such as Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels.
And the film was distributed by Cineplex Odeon Films, which is a Canadian film distribution unit, I guess. And it's funny to me, I don't know this, but the idea of a Handmade Films production distributed by Cineplex Odeon feels very comforting and nostalgic to me.
I'm sure if you went and you looked at the filmographies, you'd realize I've probably seen those logos a dozen times.
back when there was a lot more like seeing it on the DVD case and then playing the movie and like enjoying slipping into the production logos that pop up because, oh, we're going to watch that movie again. It's all very like a thing that doesn't happen for me anymore.
Yeah. It does happen for me with one company right now. A24. Anytime I see the A24 logo, I'm like, oh, the chances that this is going to be good just went up exponentially. Nice.
Okay. Hey, I think it's time to take a break. I feel a powerful quoting desire coming on, and I think I just should go say it to my kids so that you don't get irritated.
Yeah, go talk to your kids about how much wine you drink.
So, Chris, I started this recording by quoting Withnail I, or right before we began, and you were like, oh, Jesus, how dare you? So I'm not going to do it again, although there's a number of quotes about consumerism and getting money and what we expect from people and what we give to people from Withnail I that would be quite useful. But
only useful in the sense of starting a Patreon campaign ad.
But you shut it down. You shut it down so hard. So why don't you do it, dude?
Well, I would say that super context are like hippie wigs, and that they allow you to purchase into a culture that you may not have actually participated in.
Okay. We have a Patreon campaign, but it is becoming less and less important for us to ask you to join. At this point, we have 1 month of regular super context production. During that time, our Patreon is active. Our supporters are getting things like bloopers and outtakes, bi-weekly bonus mini episodes, access to a monthly Super King Context episode, all great rewards that we've heard a lot of nice things about. Thank you. And we're using the money from Patreon to pay hosting fees, cover the expenses of media artifacts, and keep the recording setup going. Any minute now, though, we're going to shift into an archival Patreon campaign. And Chris, can you explain that to them?
Yeah, so what will happen is in May of 2020, we're going to cease production of regular Super Context episodes. All we will be producing is for the Patreon. Anybody at that time who gives $1 a month will have access to all of the extra content that's been produced in the last year and a half, as well as all of the episodes. And Charlie and I will continue to record a minisode every month.
So that's really just to keep the archive of Super Context up and available. We want it to be free and we want it to be active because, again, people have said really nice things about this show. They've really validated this project and what we've done, and we would love for it to be available to more people for a long time.
Yeah, and if you want to join here in this last month, you're more than welcome to do that. We have a couple things that are coming up that you might find interesting. We're going to do an episode about the novel Hyperion, which was one of our Patreon rewards for our co-producer at the end of last year. We're also going to do an episode about Kate Bush's The Hounds of Love. And we have a Super King Context episode coming out at the end of March about Stand By Me.
Yes, and once again, Chris, are you ready for the pie eating scene, or have you still forgotten it?
I'm ready.
Our patrons have done amazing things for this show. It's been fantastic, and we love them all, and we thank them in each episode, and we're going to do that right now. Thank you so much, Alex Laird, Alice Florence, Ambrose Allen, Amit Doshi, Andy Riggs, B.B. Schwells, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Beth Gilmore, Billy Whitehouse, Bing Bong Man, Brandon Daniels, Brian Chovanich, Caroline Zoids, Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, Coco, Dave Jordan, Dave Wachter, and Elijah Tilstra.
Thank you also to Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, Ira James Udiskin, James McDonnell, Jason Puckett, Jim Taylor, Jess Staten, John Klima, John Pheasant, Joseph Aleo, Juan Patton, Hunta / Cult, Calvin Ellis, Carmela Padovich, Kate Sharon, Kevin Wetter, Christian Hirvala, Lee Fowler, Lokesh Dakar, and Luciano Fuck.
Thank you to Luigi Oswego, Melinda Hale, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Nathan Weatherford, Nick Sage, Patrick Malka, Pete Bowe, Philip, R.M. Rhodes, Rein It In, Matt and Rachel, a podcast, Roar Vinland, Rob Sloan, and Robert Negoesco.
Thank you also to Roman Marichek, Romantic Placebo, Ron Bilodeau, Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Sari Nichols, Seth Friedman, Simon Workman, Tara Mishak, Thomas Tremberger, Vealheit, and Whitney Buchanan.
Thank you, everyone. It's been really wonderful to have you as part of this community, and we hope you'll stick with us for at least a little while after we bring this all to a close.
At patreon.com/supercontext. And we're back. So, we are not the only ones who are asking the question, why is Withnail I one of Britain's biggest cult films?
It's something that people want to know.
Yeah, there's a lot written about it. A lot of listicles involve this film. So here's what we got here. This became a word-of-mouth classic because of video shops in the 90s.
87 was a perfect time for something to become a video store classic.
But listen to these lists, and some of these are bizarre, but I put them all in here. The British Film Institute voted this the 29th greatest British film of all time. Time Out magazine ranked it the 15th best British film ever. Total Film voted it the 3rd greatest comedy of all time and the 13th greatest British film of all time.
13th greatest British film, but 3rd greatest comedy. Okay.
The Observer had a 2009 poll where they interviewed 60 prominent British filmmakers and critics, and they all voted it the 2nd best British film in 25 years. That has so many qualifications attached to it. Empire Magazine says it's the 118th best film of all time. Here's the financial numbers. This film made £512 and a U.S. gross of $1,544,889. Its budget was £1.1 million. So that sounds roughly, given our marketing factor, it's probably about breaking even.
I feel, I feel like it lost money, but I wouldn't fight that. Bruce Robinson said he got £1 for the screenplay and £80,000 to direct it. 30,000 of those pounds he put back into the movie by himself.
Handmade Films wouldn't fund it. Jesus, it sounds like Handmade Films was a mess. I want to know the story about this one producer. There's got to be nasty, nasty tales about him out of school.
Well, think about the business he was in. You know that he has appeared as a character without that name in movie after movie. Probably. When people were trying to, oh God, this is going to be I'm going to take O'Brien. Is it Dennis O'Brien?
I think it was Dennis O'Brien, yeah.
Oh, is it Brian O'Dennis? Anyway, there's probably a Brian O'Dennis in some movie, and that'll be our exact replica of this dude.
So here's how the criticism goes of it. People love it. Rotten Tomatoes gives it a 94% based on 33 professional reviews. The audiences give it 1% more at 94, and that's 43,091 users.
The rare occasion where the Rotten Tomatoes critics and audience scores match.
Yeah. We talked about Alien 3 already. That was one homage within the entertainment industry. Here's a couple others. I'm going to just gloss over these because I don't want to go too deep into this. Johnny Depp really liked it. That's why he made The Rum Diary with Robinson. Will Arnett is apparently a big fan. And he's worked it into some Netflix show he was on called Flaked. Never heard of that before. Apparently, Vin Diesel is a big fan and has been spotted quoting Danny the drug dealer on British television.
Okay. And here's a quick thing. Johnny Depp, born 1963. Will Arnett, born 1970. Vin Diesel, born 1967. The movie came out in 1987. So these guys are all
Vin
the
Diesel
early
was born
20s.
in 1967. He's 10 years older than me. That's insane.
I think I do want to go down this path. Explain why that's insane.
No,
I
it's
want to
just
hear it.
wild
Tell
to
me
me.
everything.
He is like one of the biggest action stars in the world, and he's over 50. Although when you think about most action stars nowadays, they are over 50. Tom Cruise.
Or they're 22.
Johnny Depp. Yeah.
Is Johnny Depp an action star anymore?
Well, I don't know. I guess the pirate movies, do those count?
Okay, I'm done. Let's go back. All right. Here is where we get into some real cult stuff. So, okay, not only does it get sort of reprocessed by the industry, right? David Fincher, Johnny Depp, Will Arnett, Vin Diesel. These are white male paragons of Hollywood. And yet, I just realized, of course, Vin Diesel is not a paragon of white Hollywood. He's, God, I don't even know what his background is.
I don't either. Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Okay, so setting aside Vin Diesel, maybe setting aside the joke white Hollywood, male Hollywood, male Gen X Hollywood really digs Withnail I.
Yeah.
And then let's slide a little farther into the cult classic stuff. There is a drinking game associated with the movie, which is not a drinking game. It's a challenge. It's an attack. It's an attempt to destroy yourself. You're supposed to match Withnail drink for drink, which you cannot do. You will die.
Yeah, so the game says you need either gin, cider, ale, sherry, whiskey, or red wine, or you can substitute those things with lighter fluid or vinegar.
Oh, Chris, you're completely misreading that. To match him drink for drink, you require gin, cider, ale, sherry, whiskey, red wine, and then some kind of astringent lighter fluid or vinegar, because he does drink lighter fluid as the character, and Grant drank vinegar.
Okay.
Don't do it. Just don't fucking do it at all. Also, there is this event, Uncle Monty's Summer Soiree, which has been going on for, I think, 9 or 10 years. This is a quote from a website. An outdoor screening of the cult movie, which starred Richard E. Grant, Paul McGann, and Richard Griffiths, takes place at Sleddale Hall, overlooking Wet Sleddale Reservoir on the eastern edge of the Lake District National Park near Shap. I'm sure I'm pronouncing all of those places incorrectly. This year will be the 9th annual screening at the event, Uncle Monty's Summer Soiree, named after Griffith's character in the film. They go to a place that was part of the setting. It's a Sleddale Hall is
I believe
Crow
that's
Crag
where the cottage was.
Yeah, from the movie. So they do this outdoor film screening. It is a gathering. It is the embodiment of the cult classic thing. A bunch of people come together to celebrate simultaneously in person an event.
So here's the thing, right? Like, I'm kind of dismissive of this, and yet, like, 2 months ago, I went up to the Timberline Lodge to watch The Shining.
Totally.
So
you should be totally dismissive of it because it's not your thing. But you know that at the core, the drive to do this sort of thing is a true, real, and not admirable, but respectable kind of human drive.
Yeah, it's I can identify with it. One of the things that may be hard for people to identify with this film on, though, is just how white and male and upper class it is. So let's talk a little bit more about representation. You kind of tapped into this.
Yeah, I think that's what set me up when I was starting to list these actors and directors and trying to call them all white. It's that it does seem to kind of dismiss all other experiences.
Yeah, and there is also the straight factor as well. We talked about this already just in the production notes, but, you know, the producer wanted Richard Griffith's character, Uncle Monty, to be even more over the top than he is in the film. In the film as it stands, there is a certain amount of gay panic that is distasteful, I think. And there's an article that'll be in the notes written by Ashley Naftool. She says, this hasn't aged well. There's gay panic that surrounds Richard Griffith's character, Uncle Monty. When he has impassioned come-ons to Marwood in the countryside, it feels like it's just a few banjo plucks away from going into limey deliverance.
Yeah, and really what we're saying is that it becomes a plot point that the I character is scared that Uncle Monty might assault him.
Stephen Puddicombe wrote about the film, and he says, what's interesting is that all the characters have arrived at their point of self-destruction from privileged backgrounds, especially Withnail. Marwood is the I character, if we haven't already made that connection. Appears middle class, but Withnail's connections are positively aristocratic. Withnail's privilege doesn't count for anything, and part of the reason why he's sympathetic, or at the very least pitiable, is because he's not an insufferable brat who always gets his own way.
He's insufferable, but he's failing throughout the movie.
Yeah. And so he's constantly evoking this status that's impotent. He says all this stuff. He sounds absurd. He's hilarious, but he looks shoddy and he lacks any sincere conviction. And nobody expects that they're actually going to obey his commands. So
Withnail is a takedown of aristocracy, but he's not aristocratic. He is just performing aristocracy.
Well, I guess that depends on what your definition of what makes one aristocratic, right? By lineage, he is, and technically
literally
finances,
by lineage. But he's not. He doesn't have a position of power.
Yeah,
he doesn't have a position of respect. If there was ever in his background that power and respect, it's gone. Even his Uncle Monty, who is the rich line of this family, is in some ways a confounded nobleman. Right, in the modern times that he's in, and this was set in a moment when social structures were collapsing, when those authorities were supposed to be sort of discarded, and it was filmed in a time when people were really seriously feeling like we're done with all that.
Yeah,
we're gonna cap it and hide it.
There's a further quote here from Puddicombe about that. He says, perhaps because the film was set in the liberal-minded 60s, or that it was made under Thatcher's government, that championed the idea or the myth that a free market-driven meritocracy existed. Withnail I presents a scenario where being born with a silver spoon is not enough to make it. And this is from present day, Puddicombe is writing. Puddicombe says, in our current climate, where much is made by how acting jobs are more and more becoming the preserve of an elite few, it's interesting to ponder in today's society, would it be Marwood who fails or Withnail, for all of his vices, who succeeds?
So these are out of work or struggling actors who should be able to live, in 1967, 1970, whatever, should be able to live on what they make performing in plays and the occasional commercial.
Yeah.
Whereas now, if you said, they make their living from the plays they perform in, it would be like, oh my God, what Marvel movies did they make before they went to Broadway?
Yeah.
Like theater for a lot of folks is a hobbyist, not profession. It's a avocation. It is a hobby. It is a thing that you have to support yourself in other ways to do. And that wasn't always true.
Yeah. Although now we're giving away when we're recording this, given the severity of economic repercussions that we're looking at because of the coronavirus isolation, I wonder if we're going to go back to a period of time where even more draconian than what you're talking about, where like it is a hobby. It is not a living.
Well, yeah,
being an artist of any type.
There's minor industries that are all going to collapse. I can only assume that the desire for certain things and the wish for returning to normalcy, right, will keep it from being like, oh, this time's over. We've moved on. It'll be more of a, gosh, all of these businesses failed. All these theaters went under. Can we start another one? I'm hoping.
We'll see. Yeah, time will tell. One thing I'd just like to bring up before we get any further into talking about the themes of this film, it might be in the notes later on here, but I believe both Robinson and Grant mention that in their experience, the people who watch this movie the most are white dudes in their early 20s. So that's also like important to consider in terms of like representation and diversity. I wonder how many women are out there who identify as strongly with this film as some of these guys who are doing this drinking game.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the way that people have understood what Withnail I is presenting, right? Beyond just like, oh, it's an experience that I want to have.
Yeah.
But more like what is happening in the story, what is happening when we have these sort of forms of representation and this portrait of a decaying alcoholic and a struggling not alcoholic, trying to make his way. Ashley Naftule writes something that is sort of extraordinary to me, because this is something I would never think of. If you've ever been part of a creative community, you've met people like Withnail, fantastically talented human beings who'd probably make an indelible mark on their field if they could get their shit together for a day or two. Now, I don't take that from Withnail at all. Withnail to me is a train loose on the track headed down.
I think that maybe has just something to do with the differences in like your and mine, maybe Ashley's personal backgrounds.
Yeah, totally.
I absolutely recognize this. I knew Withnails. I knew people who were just human disasters, and if they could get their shit together, they would have been incredibly prolific, I think,
well,
creators.
Let me be particular about this. Do you think that Withnail is that person? The character? Do you feel like Withnail is someone that if he stopped drinking, that he would be a fantastically talented human being? I always took Withnail to be a person who had detached himself from society, and was destroying himself because he was detached. He was that kind of trickster figure, that sort of element of nature, not a person who could be productive and connected.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I think this gets into the like cultural and class nature of this film, and I don't feel comfortable speaking to it because I'm not English.
Right.
But it does seem to me that from Robinson's perspective, Withnail is like this because of his class, because he expected to have everything handed to him, and when it wasn't, that's when he withdrew and started self-destructing.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's possible to divorce the two, but I do see comparisons to people that I've met and frankly like worked with.
Well, Naftule does separate the class from the story, because they write, I think of all the brilliant people I know in Phoenix whenever I watch Withnail. Poets, musicians, artists, and actors who could do truly magnificent things if they just eased up on the Hunter S. Thompson lifestyle. Mm-hmm. I.e., that's an American version of whatever is going on in Withnail.
I used to have a roommate. Sorry, I used to have a roommate who was a musician and a writer, and he and I played music together. He one day posted onto our refrigerator Hunter S. Thompson's daily drug and alcohol consumption schedule, as if it were like some kind of like thing to live up to.
Something to strive for, yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you handle a hit of cocaine with your orange juice?
My understanding is that guy is no longer writing or producing music.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like an overly elaborate way of killing yourself, to strive for those fictionalized versions of people's drug and alcohol habits.
Yeah. Richard Luck wrote about the film, and he goes on to say, he says, when you're watching this film, there's a point where you say, all right, I get it. The world for these characters is in a hell of a state, but so is the one that I live in. And he says, but when you think about it, it actually isn't. He's not writing from the coronavirus situation, but he says it actually isn't, and neither are Withnail and Marwoods. Like, like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen to these guys? They're going to have to go back to mommy and daddy.
Well, yeah, and this is also the Lake District, which I learned about when we talked about A Tale of One Bad Rat. Richard Luck says, we're immediately reminded of what a beautiful country ours is. The film is briefly a celebration of hail fellow well-met Britishness. The writer-director clearly loves Britain and is therefore that much angrier about what was becoming of it in the age of Margaret Thatcher. The film's affection for Britain is at times expressed quite subtly, and then he goes on to list a whole bunch of like references to what was great and what was fun and what was lovely about this moment in time that they're portraying, that also seems to be sort of this is what could be good if you just like stopped being a Thatcherite free market absolutist.
So this is the stuff that escaped me when I was watching it, right? It's easier for me to see that kind of cultural affection and critique in something like Fear and Loathing than it is for me to see it in Withnail I.
Yeah, because it is subtle. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all this to say, we've been talking about like, Withnail is this quotable wreck of a human being. And, Richard E. Grant is a charismatic actor. And so this is sort of what the movie feels like. Like, it's a personality that people kind of want to take on. They don't want to be destroyed like Withnail, but they want to have that effect on people. Mm-hmm. And yet the movie appears to be, certainly at the core of Robinson's intent, to be a lifeline out of that destroyed place he found himself in the late 60s. And because of when it was made, also a lifeline out of what, and now I'm talking about stuff I know nothing about except for what my English heroes have told me. A lifeline out of Thatcher's destruction of what made post-war England great.
Okay. Well, then, you do have to turn back to this quote, though, also from Richard Luck, who says, hey, let's remember, like, there's some ugly stuff here in this film. And some of it seems like Robinson is purposely celebrating, and some of it maybe Robinson was unaware that he was being ugly. He purposely points out, he says, this film has moments where all of the characters express anti-gay, anti-black, or anti-Irish sentiments.
Despite that clearly not being Robinson's point.
Yeah, yeah. So this is, again, like you have to divorce yourself from the characters and what the characters say versus the intention of the creator. It's kind of like Paper Girls when there's homophobia in Paper Girls.
Which has to be there for the story and seems historically correct. And you wouldn't say, see, Brian K. Vaughan is a homophobe, but it makes you feel a little bit titchy. So
we turn back to Bruce Robinson then, because he's asked time and time again, what do you think it is that's made this film last so long? Why do so many people like it? And he says, what I think it does is touch that moment that we've all had where we're broke, we're starving, we're aspiring, and all knowing that it might not work in our lives. And for one of them, it does. Not definitely, but for one of them, it might. And that's the Marwood character at the end. He says, I really think audiences also love good dialogue. Brilliant photography costs a lot more than crap photography, whereas good dialogue doesn't cost any more than bad dialogue. So even a cheap film can have great dialogue in it.
So he wants to detach it from any sort of social criticism. He's saying that, the reason that it persists is because people can say to themselves, I remember being poor and desperate.
Yeah.
And I could have gone one way or the other. And as amazing as Withnail's sort of effect is, I want to transcend that situation. And I can see that the I character, Marwood, is doing it.
And then Grant goes on to point out, this is the segment that I was thinking of earlier. He says, it's a rite of passage for young men, specifically young British men. He says, they've told me that at Oxford, watching this film is like losing your virginity. It's an initiation ritual. If you haven't seen it, you must see it. It becomes a prerequisite. And Etonians, these are the students of Eton College, thought that it was about them. Other people then thought, no, it's about us. So then it crosses over between cultures. He says this is a movie that is about the young British male. They're the ones who relate to this. What I've noticed is it appeals far more to men than it does to women.
Yeah. I mean, it's been so long since I had a conversation about any of these movies with anybody. You know, like, it's been a long time since I was in a pool hall quoting movies back and forth and saying, oh, I love that bit, you know. So I can't exactly remember whether any women joined in or not.
So we get this piece from Luke Turner next, and he says something that I didn't see anywhere else in the research that's kind of blowing my mind here, and I don't know if I'm reading this the right way. He's talking about why Withnail I has become something he's turned off from, even though he originally liked it. And he says it began in the 90s, and he says specifically he blames, quote, the cheekily prattish figurehead of the gormless and garish braggadocio of the 90s lad culture, Chris Evans. I don't think he means Captain America Chris Evans. I think
it
that's
is not. Chris Evans is a presenter. He is, let's see, it says he started in radio. He worked on The Big Breakfast.
Okay. He
had the Chris Evans Breakfast Show, the One Show. He was supposed to lead a new Top Gear.
Oh, wait, I know this guy. Yeah. He's the new host on Top Gear. Okay. Yeah, I know who he is.
He is whatever the British sort of bro is.
Well,
although that's not even right. It is what Turner is saying. The gormless and garish braggadocio of lad culture.
Well, Luke Turner claims that this Chris Evans, not Captain America Chris Evans, bought the coat that Withnail wears in the film for £8,000. And then he promptly went out and destroyed it when he was in a quad biking accident.
God, you couldn't write something better than that.
It's kind of ludicrous. In my head, the whole time I was reading, I was like, man, Captain America did that? That's weird. Wait, he was like a teenager in the 90s.
So really, if we take from Luke Turner what he's saying, this movie was about something more complicated than being a person who didn't give a shit what other people thought of you and was the center of attention and could go out and drink and and dodge gay men and all that, which seems to be a kind of like dude, lad, bro culture sort of thing in Britain. That it was about these two smart but desperate men who had a really deep friendship, and yet the superficial qualities of Withnail I became the important part.
Mm-hmm.
Almost the same way that the superficial qualities of, I don't know, capitalism, consumerism, Hollywood, free market, whatever you want to say, became the important bits.
Well, he goes on to mention, apparently, if you can get a hold of the DVD and it plays in your region, there's a special on it. And this special opens up with Bruce Robinson warning what happened to the actual Withnail, that he died young. And we detailed earlier just how horrific his death was. And Robinson himself says, look, I was a heavy drinker. This is not good. And it's almost like a health and safety, warning in front of this film when you watch it on the DVD. And he points out, and then Robinson went on to make The Rum Diaries, which is a Hunter S. Thompson film, again, like celebrating just a complete drunk.
Except, is it celebrating? I mean, The Rum Diaries are a portrait of a person who's trying to be something that he is not.
I think it depends on whether you're digging below the surface or not, as you mentioned.
It's all back to, can you wear a trucker hat ironically? It's on your head. Can you say that you're making a joke of it when you're actually wearing the fucking thing?
He goes on to mention when you watch this film, they have this devil may care attitude about drinking themselves to death. But he points out, he says, that's actually more to do with something that he refers to as a sadly deceased English bravado, the kind of mentality that had a member of the famous expedition to sink German warships in World War I packing through Worcester sauce to sate his addiction to shots of alcohol.
Okay, I kind of understand what you just said, but that quote is like too full of shit for me that I don't understand.
It sounds like it is the idea that the great English alcoholic perseveres.
Yeah, what I take from that is kind of back to what you originally asked. Why do people celebrate drinking? And there is a celebration of drinking that is not about I'm so drunk, I'm dying celebration, but more that a part of life is having a drink at the end of the day, or being able to have a shot of whiskey when appropriate, etc., etc. That becomes then this sort of, my God, if you have the number of drinks that you think are appropriate to a gentleman in a day, you're an alcoholic.
I can't.
Chris just shrugged in like a,
I don't know how to measure that, because of my lack of experience with it. I will just say, as the son of an alcoholic and like somebody who I guess is somewhat familiar with the program, as it were, I can recognize that behavior in other people, but I don't know that it's necessarily up to me to judge what the amount, the quantity is that can be drunk.
Okay, well, let's pull it out of this bit then and talk more about the fact that there are two ways to understand these stories of people who are demolishing themselves because of their disappointment with drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
There's a way to say, oh yeah, this is how you do it. This is how one lives a life. YOLO, like, I can drink anyone under the table. Mm-hmm. An old head might look down and see his grandmother crawling up his arm with a knife in her teeth and just think, flashback. These sort of statements of some kind of strength or experience versus the warning.
Yeah.
This will destroy you. This here's a portrait of someone who destroyed themselves. Please don't do it. But because of, this is such a simplified version of it, but because the 60s or the late 60s, early 70s connected drug use and sort of de-squareness as like an appropriate reaction to the oppression and regressive sort of societal strictures, then you get someone who's like, oh, well, okay, so if I get a little stoned, then I'll see society for what it is. So if I get really stoned, maybe I'll understand the secrets of the universe. Or, one drink and I can relax from this sort of consumerist mindset. So if I drink a bottle of whiskey, I'll be transcendent, right?
Yeah, I guess what I keep coming back to is what some of the folks here in the research have mentioned, which is just how privileged these characters are, and that it's hard for me to sympathize with their need to self-medicate given how privileged they are. That, like, essentially, like, what we're saying here is, oh yeah, I can identify with that self-destruction because the world is terrible, and that kind of nihilism makes sense to me. That, like, well, if the world is as bad as it is, we might as well destroy ourselves while we're in it and sort of celebrate that. And yet, I don't think the world was all that bad for Robinson and Vivian necessarily, or certainly not Withnail and Marwood.
Yeah, even right now, I can say, I'm concerned for the state of the world. I'm scared for what my kids are inheriting. I worry about everything from what will the supply chain be when we go grocery shopping again, to how are we going to recover from this kind of collapse of activity infrastructure.
Yeah.
And yet, things are kind of great in this house.
Everybody I've been talking to has said something similar.
Yeah.
They're like, you know what? I never realized like how much I actually would enjoy something like this.
Can I just point out something, Chris?
Yeah.
I knew how much I would like to just stay in the fucking house. I didn't realize there would have to be a goddamn pandemic for everyone to agree with me.
Well,
but I am in a situation where this is okay for me, and it's not going to be okay for a lot of people. But you saying you've heard a bunch of people say, that means that we're part of this circle of privilege. That's
exactly
home,
where I was going to go with it. All the people who are saying that to me are privileged enough to say that.
And if I were to say, oh my God, I'm so tired of being in this house, I'm just going to start drinking, man. There's a little bit of aha, but also it's so utterly misanthropic and selfish to say I'm going to destroy myself because things aren't quite as great as I imagine they might be.
You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chainlinks.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @Christian Sager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.